I want to go ahead and introduce Domingo Vigil with the Land Use and Environment Group with the County of San Diego, and he's going to kick us off with some opening remarks. Domingo.
Thank you, Andy. I just wanted to, first of all, thank everybody for being here with us today. Welcome to our workshop on local greenhouse gas offsets. Our main goal for today is to really establish a general understanding for the context of greenhouse gas offsets, specifically as it relates to identifying projects locally in the San Diego region. We want to share some information about opportunities and constraints associated with developing local carbon offsets in the San Diego region. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted online within the next few days. Just so you have a better idea of who's in this group live today, we reached out to a number of agencies across the region, including all the different cities, the different jurisdictions, school districts, water districts, regional agencies like SANDAG. And we will be, once we post this webinar online, we will be reaching out to additional organizations, including industry groups and environmental groups, to engage them in this conversation. They will continue to have an opportunity to submit comments online, and you will do so as well. But I want to encourage everyone to be engaged in the discussion today. We really want to hear from you, want to hear your thoughts on the information that is being presented. And we will also be reaching out after the webinar with a survey to everybody participating here so that we can continue the dialogue. And I guess with that, I'll turn it over back to Andy.
Great, thank you, Domingo. So with that, I wanted to review our agenda with you a little bit more closely, give you a sense of what we'll be covering today. We've got a great set of panelists here, some experts in the field with a local understanding, and we'll be introducing each of those folks in turn. So first we'll start off with the county staff. Some representatives of the County Planning and Development Services, Darren Neufeld and Kelly Bray, will be talking about greenhouse gas emissions offsets. And then we also have our colleagues here from EPIC. Scott Andrews is going to talk to us more about the offset markets, the registries and protocols. And actually, Scott will speak more specifically to the additionality. So we have colleagues here also. Jay and John will be talking a little bit more specifically about offsets, the markets, the registries, protocols. And Scott will also talk more about opportunities and limitations within our county as well. And along the way, we're going to be engaging with you and getting input from you through a couple polling questions that we have. And again, as I said, we definitely want to encourage you to use the chat function in Zoom very specifically. So with that, as a matter of fact, I want to bring up first poll for you. We just want to get I'm going to go ahead and launch this. You should be able to see this on your screen now. What is your general knowledge of carbon offsets? Feel like you have a very high level, somewhat knowledgeable, just a little bit, or coming in pretty green, forgive the pun, none at all. So yeah, go ahead and register those. We got just over half of you have done that, and I'll show you the results here in probably in about 10 seconds or so. So I can see the counter here. Most of you have registered that. I'm going to go ahead and end it, and let me share this with you. So looks like most folks have some level of knowledge, either very high, somewhat, most of you are in the somewhat range, or at least a little bit. So good, thank you for that. We just wanted to, one way, just get you oriented to the polling tool, of course, but also give everybody a sense of, kind of what we have in the group, if you will, in the webinar. So great. So I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and move forward with introducing our first speaker. And Kelly Bray is with the County of San Diego, and she's going to kick things off and give an introduction related to greenhouse gas emission basics and CEQA. So Kelly, take it away, please.
Thanks a lot, Andy. So as Andy mentioned, my name is Kelly Bray. I'm from the County of San Diego's Planning and Development Services, and with me is Darren Neufeld, also from that department. In this first section, we're going to present a summary of greenhouse gas basics. We're going to review what the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, says about it and how we reduce greenhouse gases in CEQA. So first, let's do a primer on greenhouse gas basics. The Environmental Protection Agency defines greenhouse gases as gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. The primary greenhouse gases that we're talking about here are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. And each of these gases can remain in the atmosphere for different amount of time, ranging from a few years to thousands of years. Notably, climate change is dependent upon the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, regardless of the location where it's generated. So it's the same impact all over the world. But it's also important to recognize that greenhouse gases have different global warming potential. And that global warming potential is the measure of how much a given gas warms the Earth compared to carbon dioxide over a period of time. So carbon dioxide is typically referred to as the reference gas because it's the most common and least potent of the greenhouse gases. An example of other greenhouse gases in comparison, methane is estimated to have a global warming potential of 28 to 36 times carbon dioxide. And nitrous oxide has a global warming potential of 265 to 298 times that of carbon dioxide. So typically when you refer to carbon offsets, we refer to a standardized ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, or you'll sometimes see the terminology CO2e. That means that 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is equivalent to the other, regardless of the gases involved. So it's also the common unit of measurement when referring to carbon offsets, which we'll get to a little bit later. So let's think about CEQA for a second. As I'm sure everyone in this panel is aware, and all of our registered attendees, CEQA requires an evaluation of environmental impacts whenever you conduct a project in the state of California. So under CEQA, a significant impact is identified when a substantial physical change to the environment will occur. And these impacts can occur on land, in water, in air, and to wildlife. There are direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts that must be evaluated under CEQA. And CEQA defines greenhouse gas impacts as a global cumulative impact. So cumulative impacts refer to 2 or more individual effects, which when considered together are considerable. A project's impacts related to greenhouse gas emissions may appear small compared to the emissions in California, but when you look at it in the broader context with other projects that are being developed in the state to create greenhouse gases, it can often be considered significant. So CEQA also requires mitigation measures if there are significant impacts. There are three main ways to mitigate under CEQA. You can avoid, which is essentially a redesign of the project. You can reduce, or you can compensate. CEQA also has a definition of mitigation relevant to our discussion today, which includes, and I'll read this directly because I think it makes sense better that way: rectifying the impact by repairing, rehabilitating, or restoring the impacted environment, and compensating for the impact by replacing or providing substitute resources or environments. So this is an example of how we mitigate biological resources through mitigation banks, and we think it might be a good model for compensating the effects of greenhouse gases. So I'll turn it over to Darren to explore this concept and greenhouse gases further.
Thanks, Kelly. So at the project level, we reduce greenhouse gas emissions through on-site reductions, such as zero net energy homes with solar, electric vehicle charging stations, transportation demand management program, energy efficient features, water reductions, and more. CEQA guidelines also allow off-site mitigation for greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon offsets. Off-site mitigation can include actions that sequester carbon, like tree planting, avoid emissions through conservation, and reduce emissions, for example, through electric vehicle charging stations. CEQA does not specify any requirements for location or type of carbon offsets, only that they cannot already be required. This is the concept of additional, which we'll discuss a little bit later today. And CEQA also allows tiering or streamlining the analysis of greenhouse gas emissions if an agency has an adopted qualified greenhouse gas reduction plan. Projects that are consistent with the GHG reduction plan can implement the measures in that plan and streamline their greenhouse gas analysis. Regardless, all jurisdictions are required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as part of CEQA, either through CEQA review or as part of GHG reduction plans. In 2015, the Newhall Ranch project was invalidated by the California Supreme Court, in part based on its GHG methodology. This case changed how we analyze greenhouse gas impacts in CEQA documents. The Newhall Ranch applicant conducted an additional environmental analysis that used a net zero GHG threshold, meaning that all GHG emissions from project construction and operations had to be reduced to zero. That project used local reduction measures and carbon offsets to achieve zero emissions. And in their first draft additional environmental analysis, they developed a hierarchy of where those carbon offsets had to come from. First was on-site design and reduction measures, followed by off-site within the neighborhood, off-site within district, off-site within state, and off-site out of state. So this set up a geographic hierarchy for mitigating GHG emissions through direct reduction activities and purchase of carbon offsets. This was revised in the final additional environmental analysis to remove this hierarchy and assign a percentage that could come from local measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and through carbon offsets. So a carbon offset is a type of mitigation in which a project's GHG emissions are balanced or offset by an action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere. 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e, which Kelly referred to earlier, is equal to 1 credit. So credits range in price by project type and location, which will be discussed later in this presentation. And the price of the credit is subject to changes in the offset market, which can fluctuate often. Carbon offset credits are listed on 3 California Air Resources Board approved registries. These registries list credits for sale from carbon offset projects that have already been completed and reduced GHG emissions. These registries have standards to implement a carbon offset project that can be used to develop local projects as well. So the registries ensure the projects they list are real, meaning capable of being measured using scientific methods. So emission reductions are quantified, and offsets may only be issued in an amount that corresponds to the emissions that are quantified using those registries, methodologies, or what we call protocols. They have to be additional, meaning carbon offsets are only eligible to generate offsets if they would not have otherwise occurred without that offset activity. They cannot already be required by federal, state, or local regulations. And they have to be permanent, meaning the emissions reductions cannot be reversed. They're validated or verified. The reductions are independently verified by a third-party accredited verifier, and they have to be enforceable. The commitment to offset projects must be legally binding. So everything feasible must be done on site prior to mitigating emissions off site. This approach is supported by the California Air Resources Board. CARB said in its 2017 climate change scoping plan that where further project design features or regional investments are infeasible or not proven to be effective, it may be appropriate and feasible to mitigate project emissions through purchasing and retiring carbon credits. And the Attorney General issued similar guidance, allowing for carbon offsets to be used in CEQA mitigation. So carbon offsets are also used by Assembly Bill 900 projects to achieve no net increase in GHG as required in CEQA. This concludes our introduction section, and I'll turn the presentation back over to Andy.
Great. Thank you, Darren and Kelly. So thanks for that kickoff. And we wanted to check in as well with all of you through another poll. And I will cue that up here. Just would like to know, if you're representing a jurisdiction, are you currently using carbon offsets as a form of mitigation? And if you don't represent a jurisdiction, of course, you can make that reference too. So good, we have them coming in here. Got about half of you haven't responded. All right, very good. Keep it coming. Got about 2/3 of you have responded. So see if we can get it to 3/4, and then I'll post the results. Okay, good. That's pretty close. All right, so I'll show you. Looks like just almost half and half, if you will, those of you representing your jurisdiction. So whether you're using them right now as a form of mitigation or not. So thank you for sharing that. It's good to know. We'll take that and include that as part of our notes for today. So good. With that, I want to move us into, we're going to hear from John McDougall with Element Markets, and he's going to talk to us a little bit more specifically about offsets, introducing what are the offset markets, registries, and protocols that are available that are part of the offset environment. So John, if you're ready, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. John McDougall with Element Markets. Element Markets is a large U.S. provider of carbon offsets, as well as asset manager, marketer, and advisor within both the voluntary and compliance offset markets. Respective to CEQA, we've also been providing offsets as a greenhouse gas mitigation measure for CEQA purposes since 2010. Working across multiple sectors with respect to offsets, and then the primary developer and project proponent on all three of the CARB approved registries mentioned by Darren earlier, the Climate Action Reserve and American Carbon Registry. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about, first and foremost, the differences between the voluntary offset market and the compliance offset markets, the greenhouse gas offset registries, which are a primary stakeholder within these markets, and lastly, the protocols that are essentially the rule books for offset development and use, or I shouldn't say use, but registration and creation of offsets. So moving into the different types of markets, there are really two types of, or ways, I should say, lenses to look at markets, one being the voluntary offset market, the other being the compliance offset market. People in California and industries there were familiar with the compliance market there, which is California Cap and Trade, or AB 32. That uses compliance offsets or California compliance offsets for use as a instrument for mitigation. Less familiar maybe for some is the voluntary offset market, where different types of industries use offsets for voluntary purposes, such as corporate social responsibility initiatives. Universities use offsets to meet mitigation targets. And municipalities also use offsets for meeting voluntary targets or mitigation strategies. The differences within the offset markets are really quite small, other than the fact that compliance markets are mandated demand and are offsets within the compliance market regime can be used specifically in California to meet up to 8% of total emissions for each obligated party within California. The rest are used by state issued allowances that are issued on a quarterly auction basis. But one thing to differentiate I want to emphasize here is that as far as offset markets go, the registration, the creation, the generation of offsets are very similar. And in fact, compliance markets and offsets have been derived from the voluntary protocols or offset markets, and very essentially the same. The only difference between, or primary difference I should say, between compliance offsets and voluntary offsets is that the California Air Resources Board, at the end of the registration and issuance process, have a time period of which to review the project, the offsets, and to issue them into compliance accounts. So one thing, the subject here is really to focus in on a primary stakeholder of these offset markets, both in compliance and voluntary, and those are the greenhouse gas offset registries. And these platforms are used to essentially track and report market transactions, but also the creation, generation and retirement of offsets that are serialized and also tracked on essentially from the start of a project's registration to verification, to issuance of credits or registration of credits, all the way down to the retirement of credits. And these platforms are important in that they ensure that there are no double counting or double claims of offsets used for mitigation purposes or voluntary initiatives in the voluntary markets. And then also within the compliance markets, these registries are used as a platform for additional review or additional resources to ensure that they have a level of integrity, they're following the protocols required, and that there's a level of oversight. Also very important within the offset registries are protocols. The protocols are essentially the rule books that allow for the issuance and creation of offsets. There are protocols that are specific to each type of project type or any kind of project activity that's reducing unregulated emissions, or in other cases, sequestering CO2, for instance, in forestry projects or in agricultural-based projects. But all protocols essentially follow the same principles that Darren mentioned before. Those are real, they're additional, they are permanent, they're verifiable, and they're enforceable. All protocols are scientifically based, they're peer-reviewed, and almost all go through a public review process before being adopted and project developers can use to develop and create offsets. And a very important part about protocols as well is that all offsets that are certified and under the registry systems have to go through typically an annual verification or audit. The protocols themselves are used as basically a criteria, or again, a rule book that the proponent or project developer has to follow, and the verifier has to check against the assertions made by that project proponent. Very important process of creating and generating offsets to, again, ensure the integrity and all of the principles that were mentioned earlier. So going through some more protocol components within each protocol, again, protocols can vary across project types, but all of the requirements and the principles essentially remain the same. Each protocol has a project definition. How is the emission reduction occurring? Or how is the sequestration occurring? What are the eligibility requirements? Are there geographical limits? Does the project have to be within a developed country like the US, or does it have to be in an undeveloped country? Things like that we'll go into, or principles that we'll go into more detail with Scott Anders, is additionality and permanence. Permanence is important in sequestration type projects like forestry and agricultural, making sure that in cases that the CO2 continues to be sequestered and aren't released due to forest fires or flooding or unforeseen events that are uncontrollable. Again, project boundaries are important, baseline and project sources. Important to understand what was happening in the case of this project before it was put in place, or in the absence of the project, what emissions were occurring. And once the project is implemented on a voluntary basis, how does the project activity affect the baseline scenario, the emissions, how much reductions occur on a voluntary basis, and how are those emission reductions quantified? Every project is required to have a robust monitoring plan in place using real empirical data. Typically, that data needs to follow some kind of oversight or continuous monitoring, and calculations are performed based upon the protocol requirements or the quantification requirements within each protocol. Monitoring, again, as I said before, is very important. Record keeping, everything is done in such a way to ensure that data is real, it's representative, and it's conservative, so that offsets that are generated are actual and they go beyond a business as usual scenario. Again, reporting is very important, and within that, there's also verification. Every protocol, every project requires to go through a third-party audit before any credits are issued and before those credits can be used for any kind of mitigation. So here it lists the 3 primary CARB-approved registries, or the only CARB-approved registries, I should say, is the Climate Action Reserve, the Verified Carbon Standard, and the American Carbon Registry. Over on the right side of the screen, you'll see compliance programs that also include and house protocols. Again, it's very important to understand that all protocols in the compliance regimes have been derived from voluntary protocols. And the ones listed here, again, the Cap and Trade ARB's compliance offset program. There's also some protocols that exist in the northeastern states for the power sector and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and then also in the Canadian provinces that have their own programs, and then also Quebec that's tied into California under the Western Climate Initiative. And the important thing, and then one last thing to say, the important thing to understand is that all protocols, whether they have whether they're in forestry, whether they're in landfills or whatever, what have you, they can also be created and do not need to be used as existing, meaning that for local projects, there's an opportunity to look at ways to create new protocols, and each of these registries allow a pathway to do so. So thanks, Andy.
All right, thank you, John. Appreciate that. Thanks for that detailed overview. And so want to, as another opportunity to engage with all of you attending here, we've got yet another question here, a polling question for you. So let me put that up right now. We asked you, the previous question was about if you purchased offsets for your jurisdiction, but just want to kind of looking ahead to the next 10 years, how likely do you think your jurisdiction is to purchase carbon offsets in the next 10 years, kind of looking a little further out? So again, for those of you representing a jurisdiction, I think at least based on the last poll, it sounds like we have about 1/3 of our attendees doing that. So let me also, as you're responding to this and you think of our previous question as well, those of you who indicated that you have purchased offsets, your jurisdiction has, it'd be helpful if you don't mind sharing in the chat box. You just briefly introduce yourself. I'm with so-and-so city, for example, and we have purchased offsets, or we plan to purchase offsets soon. It'd be helpful to see that for all of us to see, I think. So if you don't mind doing that in the next few minutes or so. Good, so with that, we've got, looks like the polling is done. Let me show these results to you. So it's interesting. Seems like roughly 1/3 of you kind of not sure. Well, again, 1/3 of you not representing a jurisdiction, another 1/3 really not sure if your jurisdiction is going to be doing that in the next 10 years. But we've got roughly the other 1/3, if you will, pretty good chance, somewhat or very likely, that you'll be purchasing in the next 10 years. So that's helpful. And as I mentioned, would really appreciate those of you who said you have purchased or think you will be, your jurisdiction will be in the next coming years. We'd love to hear from you just in the chat box. If that's you, if that's your jurisdiction, that'd be great to know. So good. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing those results. Also wanted to acknowledge, we've had a couple of questions come in already through the chat box, so thank you for that. Our team will answer those in a little bit. I do want to move us into the presentation a little bit more. So do know Russ and Rajinder, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, we'll definitely be answering your question soon enough here as we get into the webinar a little bit more. So, but for now, I'm gonna, before I transition to Scott Anders, I want to prime your thinking a little bit more furthermore for our next portion, and would like to hear from all of you, perhaps after near the tail end of Scott's presentation coming up. What do you see as some opportunities related to potential regional mitigation offset banks? Might those offers be something, but what do you see as greatest opportunities for those? And also on the flip side, what might be barriers that have to be overcome to make a regional mitigation bank viable? So just kind of an early preview of question we want to dive a little bit deeper with you, but you may further benefit from hearing Scott's presentation now first to talk a little bit more about additionality, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that now. So Scott is with Epic. Scott, can you give yourself a little more background and introduction of yourself, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Andy, and welcome everybody to the webinar. Thanks for joining us. I'm Scott Anders with the Energy Policy Initiative Center, and as Darren and John have mentioned several times, this idea of additionality. So my presentation is to dig in just a little bit to help you understand what it is and why it matters. So I'm going to talk about a distinction. I'm going to talk about offsets, but I also want to talk about other greenhouse gas opportunities. Darren talked about off-site mitigation that was not offsets, sometimes called direct projects or something along these lines. I also want to talk about additionality, some of the considerations for additionality, a framework for identifying additional opportunities in the San Diego region, and then review just a few challenges for non-offset greenhouse gas opportunities. So EPIC, for those of you who are not familiar, we are the Energy Policy Initiative Center based at the University of San Diego, been around since 2005. Our mission is to conduct research and analysis in the areas of energy and climate policy and educate decision makers and students. Our funding is a variety or a combination of endowment and grants and contracts. So before I get started, I want to acknowledge a project that we are currently working on with funding from the San Diego Foundation. We are looking at local carbon offsets, and there are a few key topics that we're looking at, and whether locally generated carbon offsets result in a net GHG reduction. That first one there. Next slide. Yeah, that one is really what I want to focus in on today. This slide also provides, it shows some of the other EPIC contributors on this project. So as I mentioned, I want to make a distinction between offsets and other project opportunities that are not offsets. So next slide. So really, there are two ways to address greenhouse gases, and I think both Darren and John have kind of alluded to this, but I really wanted to kind of hammer the point home here. And that is, you can either avoid future emissions, those are sometimes called reductions, or you can have negative emissions, which physically remove emissions from the atmosphere. Sometimes those are referred to as removed or sequestered emissions. Each one of those categories have offset protocols, but there are projects that could be done that are not considered in those offset protocols. And I want to talk about some of those today as well. So the CEQA guidelines, as referenced earlier, talk about ways to mitigate the significant effects of greenhouse gas emissions. And the projects can use, as Darren mentioned, once they've done everything on site to reduce emissions, they can then go off site. They can implement off-site measures, including offsets that are not otherwise required. So in CEQA, it sort of contemplates a project using offsets or doing projects that are not offsets. And so that's kind of, again, what I want to highlight here. Examples of these offsite measures might include planting trees, installing electric vehicle chargers, converting buses to electric. Again, I'm not talking about offsets in this example. So what is additionality? So to answer that question, I provide a couple examples of definitions that other people have provided. And so already referenced is the Resources Board and their offset program, or their cap and trade program, which allows offsets. And as mentioned earlier, this is in the compliance market, in the cap and trade compliance market. And CARB has outlined 6 criteria for those offsets. Again, already mentioned. I'm going to zoom in on additionality. Next slide. So CARB has a kind of 2-part test for additionality. The first is whether or not the project exceed, or the emission reductions or removals exceed those that otherwise would be required by law, regulation, or legally binding mandate. And then the second part is whether or not they exceed a conservative business as usual scenario. And so I'm going to provide an example in a few slides for each one of these 2-part tests to kind of show how that works. I also wanted to show, as the previous presenters have mentioned, that there are registries, and some of the registries have voluntary offset opportunities. And this one is just an example of the Climate Action Reserve. Their program principles are very similar. And looking at additionality, they have a legal requirement, which is very similar to the ARB's legal requirement. And then they have their second test is the performance standard test, which is very similar to the it wouldn't have otherwise happened, wouldn't have otherwise occurred. So it's very similar to that business as usual test that the ARB has. So, you know, some similarities here in how the ARB is addressing offsets in a compliance world and how the Climate Action Reserve is also looking at that way in the voluntary world. So, so just looking at this two-part test that the Air Resources Board has, the greenhouse gas reduction or removal would have to exceed what is otherwise required by law. So that means we would have to be looking at things like the federal corporate average fuel economy standards, state regulations and law around the renewable portfolio standard, the low carbon fuel standard, building energy codes, and then at the local level, many jurisdictions are adopting or considering adopting, for example, local energy efficiency ordinances or REACH codes. So any offset or other project would still have to be additional to all of these levels of requirements. So the second part of that test is that it has to exceed a business as usual scenario. And the example that I provide here is looking at rooftop solar. So in a typical climate action plan, there would be an assumption about the future installations of solar due to policy, but also from the market itself. And so we would have to consider that as well. And I provide an example later in the presentation. So why is additionality important? And again, this was alluded to earlier in the presentation, but if a claimed avoided or negative emissions would have happened anyway, then the activity does not result in a net reduction of greenhouse gases. And ultimately that's the point, getting back to Kelly's comment about it being a global cumulative impact greenhouse gases, that is. So just a couple examples in a context of a climate action plan, and I'm going to refer to a lot about climate action plans because in our region, we have almost every jurisdiction in our region has a climate action plan. There's also significant interest in local offsets. So that's one of the reasons I'm zooming in on climate action plan measures. So in this case, for example, if a local policy, a jurisdiction wanted to adopt a local policy to achieve more miles driven by electric vehicles, that would have to be in addition to or different from what would already be required or result from state policies and programs. Otherwise, it would be double counting. In the context of a new development program, purchasing offsets for CEQA compliance, and let's say we assume that the goal is carbon neutrality, and the project reduces emissions on site to the extent feasible, but still has residual emissions. Offsets could be used to neutralize those emissions, but if they're not additional, the project emits more than it really is allowed. And again, this discussion of additionality applies to offsets, but it also can apply to other projects that are not offsets. The same standard would apply. So a couple other considerations for additionality, sort of in addition but supplementing what we've already talked about, is whether or not there's a climate action plan in place. There are a couple scenarios in our region. So there's only one jurisdiction that has no cap. And so it's not clear whether or not there would be additional requirements in that jurisdiction that might be related to greenhouse gases. There are also CEQA qualified greenhouse gas reduction plan caps, so to speak. They're often mitigation for the general plan, require substantial evidence, have enforceable GHG emissions measures, and generally cover more of the greenhouse gas emissions than some of the other examples presented here. The other option is a policy cap, which is more of an aspirational document with policy goals, and it may or may not have local requirements. So how does this affect opportunities for offsets or other greenhouse gas reductions? Well, it's not clear, but it seems that this is definitely a factor that we would have to think about, or a filter we'd have to use to try to determine whether a project is in fact additional. There's also a question about whether a project is inside the cap or outside the climate action plan. inside the climate action plan or out. And so generally the way that climate action plans are developed is that there is a business as usual, generally or typically based on the general plan build out. That's what emissions would have happened if nothing changed. Then we account for state and federal policies. So that would bring us down to that orange line, which is sort of an adjusted business as usual. And then that would leave a local gap for local climate action plan policies to get us to that lower, lighter blue target. Next slide. But this often doesn't account for all of the emissions that occur in a jurisdiction. Next slide. So this creates what we're calling inside the cap and outside the cap. And so if your project is covered, so to speak, by policies at the state and federal level or at the local level, or considered in the climate action plan, it would be sort of inside the cap. We're saying that's roughly equivalent to the on-site aspects of a project, or it could be outside the cap, and it's not covered in either the greenhouse gas inventory. So if it's outside the cap, it's out of the greenhouse gas inventory, or the emissions are, and it's outside the boundary of the jurisdiction. If it's inside the cap, emissions are considered in the inventory, and it's inside the boundary of the city. These are important considerations to determine whether a specific project is, and the emissions that result are additional. So why does it matter? So Andy, let's skip to 2 more slides. That's in the interest of time. 1 more. So this is an example of kind of projects that might be inside the cap or outside the cap, and who might be eligible to claim reductions from those projects. And so the first row is a local jurisdiction climate action plan measure. Inside the cap, it could be energy efficiency, electric vehicles, increased transit. Outside the cap, there could be opportunities to destroy industrial gases or capture methane. I'm not suggesting these as viable options. I'm just saying that these are options. But if they're not considered in the greenhouse gas inventory, then they're outside the cap and not able to be considered. If the next row down, we're looking at a new development project. If they're looking for offsite mitigation, they can't necessarily be using projects or categories already covered by the climate action plan. But if there are projects that are quote unquote outside the climate action plan to destroy emissions, capture methane, plant trees, convert EVs, convert vehicles to EVs, those might be additional projects for that specific purpose. So there's this question of conservative business as usual is really important in the context of a climate action plan. And this is the solar example that I referred to earlier. In a climate action plan, the dark blue line, the CAP climate action plan business as usual projection would show the amount of solar we would expect over the time horizon of the plan. There could be local projects, for example, an ordinance requiring rooftop solar on commercial buildings that would increase and would be additional to that amount. Next slide. The business as usual would account for policy and market expansions. Next slide. The question is, how would we determine if any individual solar project is above that blue line, that dark blue line in the middle, or below it? In other words, does a single project help us get to what we have assumed in the climate action plan, or is it indeed above? So this is an example of how that business as usual test from the Air Resources Board comes into play in a specific local example. So just some high-level thinking about kind of how to identify additional opportunities in the San Diego region, either for offsets or for other non-offset projects. The framework here is conducting a gap analysis to determine whether there are opportunities. This could include a regulatory and policy screen, looking at existing offset protocols. We're going to hear in the next presentation about some work that's already been done in that area, and looking for other projects, not offsets, whether they're new project areas or expanding and accelerating existing project areas. So that's a gap analysis that would be very helpful. Evaluating possible opportunities evaluating those opportunities. So once we've identified an area that we believe, or a category of projects that we believe is additional, we want to know, does it have any what's the greenhouse gas potential? Is it a ton or is it 1 million tons? And is it scalable? Is it cost effective? And there are probably many other criteria we could run it through. So kind of, again, a high level way of thinking about this is that there is this kind of regulatory policy screen that will identify some categories. Then we can look at the potential, and then we can look at the cost. And this would be a shrinking pool of options, I think, as we went further down into the analysis. It's also possible that in this process we'll identify areas that may be fruitful but either don't have protocols in an offset context or other methods in a non-offset context. There's been some discussion in our area around planting eelgrass and other kinds of wetland restoration, natural and working land solutions that might require some additional science and some additional work. And then finally, Andy asked about thoughts about a mitigation bank. Well, you know, if we're going to move in this direction, we should be asking the question, what is that mechanism or structure? There are examples of there are existing offset registries, there are mitigation banks, there are exchanges. There could be other mechanisms or combinations of mechanisms to create a functioning local greenhouse gas exchange of sorts. So just quickly, a couple challenges that arise when we're talking about these other project opportunities that, again, are not offsets outside the context of the registries. But what we find is that the questions are very similar to those raised in the registry. So who determines additionality and approves additionality? Is it each jurisdiction of the lead agency of a particular project? Do we want to have consistent methods across our region, or does it matter? And could one city in the north of the county have one way of doing it and then a jurisdiction in the south part of the county doing something different? Who keeps track is one of the functions that John mentioned, because we want to make sure that projects aren't double counted. And who determines what would have happened otherwise? It's a significant question in many of the areas that we're looking at in terms of offsets and other projects, whether or not they're additional or would have happened anyway. So just a few, there's a lot more, but that's just a taste of some of the challenges. I think that's my last slide.
Very good. Yes, Scott West, thank you very much for that. So thanks again to Scott. A lot of great information here to share. And I want to thank everybody else, to all of you who's participating. We had a lot of great comments that have been flowing in specifically. So, and I wanted to acknowledge Russ asked a question more about why offsets can only provide for emissions reductions beyond what's minimally required. And Russ, hopefully, since you asked that question, presenters here have kind of covered those bases for you, I trust, I hope. If not, please do send us another chat and let us know if you have something more specific you wanted to probe related to that initial question. So, and Rahinder, thank you very much. You also initially asked a question about whether CEQA, if there's an intent around CEQA offsets aligning with the state level compliance. And then you also provided additional context as you oversee the state's climate programs at CARB. So thank you for that, including the cap and trade. So I think everybody hopefully has been perhaps tracking that as well. A lot of good commentary. I don't want to fully recap what was noted there in the messages, but and Russ, thank you for acknowledging that we got your question answered. So and again, Rahinder really provided a lot of good information here related to the state's compliant offset program. So thank you for that. If you all haven't had a chance to look at that in the chat, a lot of good context there as well. So so I'm going to turn back to our polling question here. And as we noted, we wanted to kind of touch base with you about this notion of regional mitigation banks. And so I've posted this here now. And again, if you're representing a jurisdiction, what do you think, how interested is your jurisdiction in exploring development of regional mitigation bank? So just want to kind of, check in with all of you along those lines, kind of see where you're, to the extent you know, where your jurisdiction is standing right now on consideration of something like that. Good, so that's coming in here. And just over half of you, so about literally 30 people have voted. So I'll go ahead and share this with you now. Seems like more interested than not, or that we may not know. So that's a good sign. Sounds like this is something we can explore a little bit more closely. And so I'd like to come back to that question and have you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts about the greatest opportunities around regional mitigation offset bank offers, as well as some of the barriers that would need to be overcome. So if you could offer your thoughts related to that in the chat, I'd really appreciate that. And I think for all of us, for all of our benefit, to kind of hear and see that, those questions would be great. So, so along those lines, I want to go ahead and transition to talk a little bit more about greenhouse gas offsets. And to do that, we're going to bring forward Jay Wintergreen with First Environment. I'm sorry, I apologize. John McDougall, you're going to come back, right? John's going to come back, who we heard from a little while ago, and pick up to talk a little bit more about opportunities and limitations. And then Jay Wintergreen will also be coming in right thereafter to continue that information. So with that, John, can you able to come on and continue on for us?
Yep. Yeah, thank you, Andy. I appreciate it. And just so for this portion of the presentation, we're going to both Element Markets, self-representing Element Markets, and Jay Wintergreen representing First Environment are going to talk about the markets from a demand and supply standpoint, and then move into specific opportunities and limitations for developing local offsets within the County of San Diego. And Jay will dive more into the supply side. I'm going to focus on the demand side. And also too, with respect to the questions, I'm happy to answer some of those, and some of the, I think, if I'm reading them right from Rajinder and some others, I'm happy to provide clarification on that as well at the end. But moving in into the to this portion of the presentation. So offset, want to go again, demand in San Diego County, but also kind of setting a context for total demand in globally and U.S. and the market itself. And I do want to differentiate between, again, demand here from the different types of markets. It's important when you're thinking about these markets to differentiate between voluntary offsets and compliance offsets. And for all intents and purposes, for here in the U.S., the compliance offset market really falls in cap and trade in California. And so when we're looking at these numbers that I'm about to provide, please think of them in the context of voluntary offsets, which have been used and can be intended to be used for CEQA mitigation, whereas CCOs or California compliance offsets are designated for that cap and trade program. So for demand for decertified offsets and is trending upward. This is absolutely something that we've seen as a marketer and a large scale supplier of offsets. Over the last 2 or 3 years in the voluntary market, the demand, pricing, and liquidity has increased significantly. Currently, right now, based on 2019 and 18, the total U.S. market transacts for anywhere between 15 to 20 million tons, metric tons of offsets annually. Globally, it's around 100 and 120 million metric tons of offsets annually. Again, this is from a voluntary perspective. And again, these are both these these geographical scopes are trending upward, and we'll get into the reasons for that in a little bit later. And then, so again, kind of splicing up the demand categories here, we have for local, which is defined by the boundary of the County of San Diego. Currently, right now, we based on available information, there are large development projects that represent roughly 3.6 million metric tons of offset demand to meet really a net zero initiative or mitigation requirement there. So I want to call attention to this. Given the size of the U.S. market at 15 to 20 million tons, and the demand within just a county region of California is 3.6 million tons, it's quite large, and it really kind of tells the story there of the potential demand coming for CEQA mitigation. And then also moving into demand for starting again, backing up from a global scale, what's affecting voluntary markets globally? Well, one such initiative is really the what we call the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for international aviation. This is expected to have a huge demand impact on the voluntary market globally. It's expected that hundreds of millions of tons moving into the 2020s will be needed for this program. And they are setting specific criteria for these offset projects. But again, from a global perspective, this is expected to create a lot of new projects and new demand that will move the needle both in liquidity and pricing for global markets. Moving on to the state demand. So focusing in on for California, state demand for greenhouse gas offsets. Again, a big portion of this demand comes from cap and trade. If you're in California, again, the rules, just generally the rules for offset use that covered entities can use up to 8%, or 8% of their emissions can be, offsets can be used to mitigate up to 8% of their emissions. And this translated, if you were to calculate the total emissions across the board based on California Air Resources Board's website, this is a potential demand of up to 26 million metric tons of offsets annually. And I would say that from a geographical perspective, about 15% of offsets that are CCOs or California compliance offsets come from inside the state of California. The rest come from the US or from Quebec. And then again, something to keep in mind too, starting in 2021 under AB 398, the allocation or the use of offsets is going to be reduced to 4%. And more importantly, for the context of this discussion, that half of that has to have a direct environmental benefit to California, which for many, that's going to likely be that offset projects need to be located within the state of California. So this is going to push a lot of demand for offsets within California. We've already started to see that, and this will be, again, in direct demand and competition with CEQA or local or state-based offsets for CEQA mitigation. Local demand for greenhouse gas offsets is certainly within CEQA context. We are seeing a lot of offsets, not only demand for within the County of San Diego. I had mentioned before around 3.6 million that's currently being tracked based upon construction and operational emissions of the large development projects. But across the state of California, also within environmental impact reports, we are seeing offsets being disclosed or being mentioned as a potential off-site mitigation measure. Currently, right now, we're tracking roughly 20 million tons across these EIRs for offset use. Again, that's potential demand, but it just gives you an idea of the total amount that could be used or needed and put pressure on the market for use, which again is going to likely, if offsets become a mainstay, is going to push for more offset development and again more reductions that will occur. And then one thing to keep in mind too as well is the offset market again is not mutually exclusive to just CEQA mitigation, and that's really the point to drive here. For using offsets, developing offsets, you will have to keep in mind from a demand perspective that there's pull from other sources that want to use these offsets, whether it be from a compliance perspective or from a voluntary perspective. And from there, I believe we're moving on to supply perspective. So I want to introduce Jay Wintergreen for First Environment. He will go over in more detail supply on how offsets are created and with a unique perspective for in the County of San Diego.
Thank you, John. Again, this is Jay Wintergreen. I work for First Environment. Just a brief introduction to First Environment. First Environment is a strategic environmental management consulting firm, and our greenhouse gas group specializes in corporate and municipal emission inventories, emission reduction technical assistance, and third-party verification services. So recognizing the large demand that exists for offset leads us into the question of what offsets might be available in San Diego County. And so we examine that issue, and the next slides speak to some of the points and questions that were actually raised in Scott's earlier presentation. So our process to look at the available offsets in the county began by looking at the available protocols from the 3 primary registries in North America: the Climate Action Reserve, Verra's Verified Carbon Standard, and the American Carbon Registry. And from those registries, we identified 127 protocols. However, some of those protocols aren't applicable for use in San Diego County. Some are only eligible in specific countries and regions. For example, there are protocols that target activities in Canada or Mexico. Some of the protocols identify activities that don't occur in San Diego County. An example of that might be rice agriculture or commercial forestry. And then finally, which kind of ties back to Scott's presentation, is some of them are not additional due to California climate and other regulation, including the cap and trade program, as well as the low carbon fuel standard. So once you've removed all those protocols that aren't applicable, you're left with about 46 protocols. And some of those protocols are very similar between the registries, between the different registries. So you end up with approximately 25 unique offset project activities identified as candidates for projects in San Diego County. And the next slide shows the list of protocols that we identified through this process. So once we had this list, we did 2 more checks to see if there were any other opportunities. First, we expanded our search to include other programs outside of the 3 voluntary registries. We looked at 2 other North American cap and trade programs besides the California cap and trade program. That's WCI and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which both have been mentioned prior to this. We also looked at the Canadian provincial programs. And then finally, we looked internationally to the Clean Development Mechanism projects. And these projects are targeted for use primarily in developing countries. And when we performed this check, we didn't identify any additional offset protocols that we hadn't already reviewed as part of the initial voluntary registry review. And then we did one more check, which was, now that we had the list of all the candidate protocols, we started to check the registry databases to see if there were any projects from these protocols that were active in San Diego County. And that check identified just 1 project in San Diego County, but unfortunately there are no offset credits available from that project at this time. Our analysis then looked at other factors that are critical to offset project development in the county. The first being offset project costs. Our initial analysis of that issue was, unfortunately, that the costs are highly specific to both project types as well as the individual project characteristics. However, we've developed a general framework to look at those costs, and that breaks down into project activity costs, project development costs, and crediting transaction costs. Project activity costs are those activities that are actually necessary to perform the activity. For example, a dairy digester construction, or the purchase of ODS for the purpose of destroying that gas and keeping it out of the atmosphere. Project development costs, these are what I like to call the carbon project costs. And these are the development of project documents, monitoring the project activity. So that might be carbon stock sampling in forests, or metering the destruction of methane or ODS. and then using that information to prepare the calculations, to prepare the reports that then are submitted to the registries for the crediting process. And then once that occurs, then there are activities that are associated with that crediting process. And those include both costs that are associated with participation in the registry, such as registering the project, issuing the credits, or transferring the credits between parties, as well as project services that are related to the project, such as applying, using consultants, the verifiers that have already been referred to, as well as brokers who transact the credits between parties. Another aspect that's important to project development is the schedule, is a project development schedule. How long does it take for a project once it starts to produce tradable credits? And again, these schedules are very specific both to project types and the individual project characteristics. However, again, to provide a general framework, there's roughly 8 steps that every project goes through. That starts with the development of the project. So what is the project? What is the project activity actually? What is it? And describing that project. And then many of the registries require that information to be validated. Does it meet the requirements of the protocol? Is it consistent with the requirements of the registry? And so once that project design is approved, usually by a third party, then the registry will list or register that project, meaning that it is eligible now to generate offsets. However, now the project needs to actually start. So whatever activity the project addresses needs to begin. If that's the operation of the digester, conservation of the forest, destruction of the ODS. And as that activity is occurring, then monitoring of that activity needs to occur. Then there's the reporting period, which is periodically, usually annually, the project takes that data, performs emission reduction calculations, and prepares a report or an assertion claiming the emission reduction credits, the offset credits. That's submitted to a third party for verification. And if it's approved, then the registry issues credits, and now you have your tradable offset credits. So what is a general time frame for moving through these 8 steps? If a project was organized, and depending on the registry and the project type, some projects could complete this process in as short as 2 years. However, a more typical time frame to move through this process would be at least 3 to 4 years. And that assumes that the project is following a registry protocol as it appears, and doesn't require a new protocol or significant modifications to those protocol requirements. So the next set of slides, once we considered these offset protocols and the availability of offsets relative to those protocols, we started to look at what other opportunities are out there. What would be other options that are not represented by these existing project activity, by these existing protocol activities. So we went through a number of exercises to consider that. The first was to look, to kind of change the perspective, and instead of starting with the protocols, actually starting with the emission sources and saying what sources are not regulated, because one of the limitations to using protocols was that due to California climate regulations and additionality issues, the protocols weren't additional. And so we changed the perspective, looked at inventories to say, well, what are the emission sources that are unregulated in these emission inventories? And for an example, we started with the county's greenhouse gas inventories. What we found was that most of the emissions in the inventory were regulated emissions. those that were associated with transportation, electricity, landfill, and natural gas. So these are emissions that are already captured under cap and trade or other climate regulations. However, we identified that a portion of the emissions that were attributed to agricultural activities are currently unregulated, and these include soil management, enteric fermentation, and manure management. And so, again, it was through this process that we were able to say, well, these might be some other areas within the county that might be opportunities for offset project development. Then finally, one of the things we also noted was, and this is very typical of inventories, that sometimes inventories don't include emission sources. Those emission sources are omitted either because the sources are very small, or in some cases there isn't data that is readily available to quantify those emissions. So again, this is an opportunity to go back and kind of take a second look at a greenhouse gas inventory for the county or another location and say, well, did we miss something in this inventory that then would be almost by definition unregulated and an opportunity for an offset project. The next opportunity that we looked at was to consider emission reductions that don't meet the typical, don't technically meet the definition of greenhouse gas offsets. So one of the earlier presentation talked about what some of those requirements are. They're real, they're verifiable. And so, but there are some emerging programs that are kind of working outside of some of those typical requirements. And one of an example of that program is forward mitigation units that are issued by the Climate Forward program. And so these are slightly different than greenhouse gas offsets in that they're issued for forecast emission reductions instead of historical reductions. So they're issued ex ante before the bulk of the activity occurred versus ex post, again, that the credits are issued after the emission reduction has occurred. And this has some benefits in terms of it provides upfront financing that can make some challenging projects more feasible. Examples of these are digesters or forestry projects. So digesters require a very significant upfront investment before you can start to generate offset credits. And so that upfront financing facilitates that type of project. And forestry is a slightly different problem in terms of forestry. It takes a long time for projects for the trees to sequester carbon and for a material amount of offsets to be generated. And so if you provide the financing up front, that financing can actually fund those activities going forward. However, it's important to note with some of these emerging programs that they do pose some risks relative to more traditional offsets. And an example of one of these risks might be that project underperformance, failure, or abandonment could lead to those forecast and credited emission reductions not actually being realized. So one of the last areas we looked at, we kind of did some analysis in terms of, well, where are most of the opportunities in the protocols coming from, and are there similar activities that just might not have protocols designed for them yet. And so when we looked at the candidate protocols, 12 of those 25 activities come from sequestration through land use management. And that's from forests, grasslands, soils, and wetlands. And so one potential opportunity would be to look at, are there other land types in the county which could provide these sequestration opportunities? And is there an existing protocol in place, or maybe a protocol could be developed to meet that specific opportunity. Somewhat similar to this is the area of blue carbon. And so blue carbon is an emerging interest in coastal and marine ecosystems that act as carbon sinks, again, providing sequestration services. And the ecosystems are mangroves, tidal marshes, and seagrasses that would sequester carbon. So this is kind of a new area, and there haven't been many projects of this type that have been developed. But it is generating a lot of interest and could provide an opportunity for a county like San Diego, which has some of these coastal and marine ecosystems. So in summary, in-county and in-state offset demand is very high. And the greenhouse gas offset supply may be limited. This is due to relatively few protocols, which was created primarily from the issue of regulatory additionality. California climate regulations already cover a large amount of the emission sources and therefore the emission reductions within the state and then within the county. Most of the supply in the county, based at least on our protocol analysis, would originate from land use sequestration activities. However, there's some other options to consider. Those are creditable non-offset emission reductions. Again, the Climate Forward program is an example. And then also emerging emission reduction activities for which either protocols or do not exist, or there aren't a lot of projects that have been developed yet. And so next steps to kind of complete our analysis of the supply of offsets in the county would be to use these candidate protocols to identify actual project opportunities. Are the protocols that exist, are there opportunities to develop an actual project from those activities? And then once we have some candidate projects, what would be the emission reduction yields from those projects? Are they large? Are they small? How many offsets could be generated by those candidate projects? And then finally, tying this back to Scott's presentation, looking at the candidate project costs and using the costs that we estimate from those projects to calculate a cost per emission reduction to facilitate future decision making on this area. And with that, that concludes my presentation. We appreciate the opportunity and we'll be glad to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate both John and Jay covered a lot of ground there as well. Again, Scott Anders, Darren Neufeld, Kelly Bray, thank you for all the work you put into preparing this information and laying out a lot of great critical information and data for us to consider. And again, to everybody here, we want to make sure we spend our remaining time with you talking more closely about the topics that we've had come up recently. And as I mentioned, we were hoping to hear from you, and we've had some response already. That around regional mitigation banks and some additional comments and questions. And so again, to remind you, we'd love to hear more about your thoughts about opportunities for regional mitigation offset bank offers, but also the barriers as well. So as you're further thinking about that and sending us your thoughts through the chat, please go ahead and do that. But I'm going to turn also to, I want to show you all an interesting feature that we have here. All the comments and questions you've been submitting through the chat, we have organized on a digital whiteboard is one way to think of it. I'm going to go ahead and display that for you right now. So I'm going to shift my screen share to that. And you should now be able to see that. So what we have here is, as I called it, a kind of a digital whiteboard. It's officially called a mural. That's the tool. And what we've done here, we've been organizing, our team behind the scenes have been organizing your input on this digital whiteboard. It's kind of part of our record for the, the discussion we've had today. So for example, here's some screenshots of the polling questions that we had with you earlier in the discussion. As you'll recall, we asked about your general knowledge of carbon offsets, if your jurisdiction's using them, planning to use them, and then of course interest around the Regional Mitigation Bank. And so I'm also going to scroll a little further over, and my colleagues behind the scenes have been helping to take some of the comments that you've put into the chat and bring forward here on these kind of digital stickies, Post-its, if you will, just to kind of further organize things. And again, I want to thank all of you for all those comments as they've come in. We've had some different questions here, some of which I think have been answered already, about, related to emission reductions and the intent of CEQA offsets aligning with state level compliance. And I'm gonna, in a moment, I'm gonna open up the microphone, by the way, to a couple people who are gonna speak to some of these questions as well, at least. So there's some good questions here, and I think our team will speak to some of these overall in a moment. And again, these are all things that I think you've all seen in the chat window as we've been going for the last hour and a half. But so you see that here, a lot of good comments from the state, from Rajinder, who we're going to hear from in a moment, by the way, over the audio. And I want to thank also the city staff, City of San Diego staff who were here. They provided some comments. So I'm going to slide our view over here a little bit. We've had some comments again on the regional mitigation banks about potential constraints, the costs around them, the infrastructure needs, oversight, project protocols required in the staff level. And again, would like to hear more from you about opportunities as well. So I'm going to scale this back a little bit, but I'm also now going to turn to, let's see, I think, let's see, let's see, Darren, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and unmute you. Can you talk a little bit about, I know one recent question we had was from Brendan Reed at the Airport Authority, talking about the Climate Forward program and kind of any response to that question that you might have. And then I want to turn over to Rajinder as well. So Darren, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And thanks, Brendan, for the question. And it looks like Robert Lee from Climate Action Reserve just opined too in the group chat. If there's any particulars about Climate Forward, we could probably turn to Robert too. But just to answer Brendan's question, yeah, we have been looking at Climate Forward, especially in the CEQA context. As Robert kind of intunes there, it was first started kind of as Newhall Ranch was looking to develop local reductions in LA County and in the area of their project. My understanding is I think there's about 5 or 6 protocols that have been adopted to use for Climate Forward. So we've definitely looked at those, especially the photovoltaic installation one, which is kind of a common request to do locally from local projects. So just to answer your question, yeah, we have been looking seriously at that program, and I agree it does offer a unique opportunity for CEQA mitigation. Good.
Yeah, thank you. And as Darren just mentioned, as you can all see in the chat, Robert Lee, with the Program Director for Climate Action Reserve, has chimed in here about Climate Forward. Thank you for that, Rob. Really appreciate that. So take a look. He's clearly willing and happy to answer any questions here, either now or as follow-up after this event. So thank you for that. I'm going to now, Rajendra Sahota I'm going to introduce her. And again, Rajendra, thank you for your patience, for all the great input you've been offering. And in a moment, I'm going to open up your microphone. So stick with me here for a moment here.
Hi, Andy. I think it's unmuted.
Oh, good. Thank you. We've got you. I've got teammates who are doing a better job at me in controlling all this. So go ahead,
no
please.
Worries.
Thank you for all your input, and would love more thoughts that you've been sharing.
Sure. And thanks to the county for the invitation to participate. One of the things that we did focus on in that 2017 scoping plan was how we could further support local action and local mitigation. And so I was happy to hear a previous presenter speak to the 2017 scoping plan. But I think what I wanted to really focus on was some of our experience at the state level and some of the things that I think at the local level where there are options for flexibility. So at the state level, we are governed by AB 32 and it have very specific criteria. I think there was a slide with 6 criteria that we apply. We are mandated to apply that criteria to offsets. And we defined those terms. We went ahead and implemented those terms. And offsets have a sordid history, right? So some people think they're great because they help direct money and funds into actions that can't be achieved through mandates or other kinds of mechanisms. And some people think they're a get out of jail free card and that they shouldn't be allowed, and that there's been bad history on offsets in other international programs. And so they carry this baggage no matter where offsets go or developed. And so we were sued and we defended our program. But going through all of that, what we realized was that for local mitigation, we don't believe there is a bounding to AB 32 criteria for local mitigation for CEQA purposes. And so when I hear the term CEQA offsets, in my mind, I automatically switch it to CEQA mitigation. Because once you switch it to CEQA mitigation, you can still hold some of those principles, but they don't have to be as strict as the way that we've done it at the state level. And that, again, is in response to the lawsuit and the mandate. So when we're looking at things like additionality, beyond mandates, we have to do beyond federal, state, and local mandates. There could be flexibility that at the local level, you could choose to define additionality only by what is mandated locally, and that anything above that local mandate could be considered additional for the purposes of CEQA. You could also decide that in terms of verification, it's not third-party verification, but it's some auditing program that's done by a local agency. There was a program that was launched in the earlier this decade called the CAPCOA RX. And that was where a group of local districts had gotten together and they had developed some protocols that they thought could be applicable for CEQA mitigation within their boundaries. Some districts looked at places like the Climate Action Reserve and other voluntary registries, but the districts themselves had at one point had a series of protocols and project types that they had identified that they thought would be good candidates for local action and to help them feed mitigation for CEQA purposes. That program was a little ahead of its time, but I thought it was really good because they pooled their resources. And this is the infrastructure administration portion of this. It doesn't matter if your offset program has 2 project types in it or if it's going to have 3 or 4 dozen. You still need the same infrastructure. You need to have a system that can track 1 trade versus 100 trades or versus 1,000 trades. And our tracking system cost us several $1 million to put together. We needed to have staff that could accredit and oversee our third-party verifiers. And so the model that exists at the state level doesn't have to be replicated in its entirety at the local level. And there is an opportunity at the local level to think of CEQA mitigation, not in the traditional sense of offsets, but what things do we need to fund here and what criteria do we want to set for funding those actions here? So I just wanted to flag that one of the things we tried to do in the 2017 scoping plan was kind of offer an alternative to where local jurisdictions, local governments could design a way to mitigate for CEQA, but build their own rules around it. And again, I think consistency is important, and to the extent that we saw the air districts try to do that earlier in this decade, it may be worth looking at the history of how far they got, the kinds of protocols that they had, and if those are of interest, what criteria did they use to build those protocols? So really, those were the comments I wanted to share. I hope it's helpful. Happy to answer any questions. I will say that for us to set up the offset program, it took about 3 years of public workshops, and then it took another 2.5 years to get the systems in place and then get the verifiers in place. So it wasn't an overnight task. It took a while, and every protocol is like a regulation and went to our board, and it was contested because everybody wanted to change one thing here or there because the quantification resulted in more or less offsets that would be issued. So a lot of work for a program that's about 8% of our total program at the Cap and Trade, for the Cap and Trade program. But there are opportunities to think about CEQA mitigation to incentivize actions locally, and especially considering the economic conditions right now and the bleak outlook for incentive programs or some of the state level programs for local action. There's an opportunity to think about how to direct funding for CEQA mitigation into some of those efforts. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for making the time. Let me ask our kind of core team here, some of our presenters and such behind the scenes, any kind of follow-up, or we've had a range of comments and some questions. I know some of which were answered already through the presentation, but I wanted to check in with the group and see if there's any further thought they wanted to provide any responses or follow-up comments to folks. John McDougall, did you have some thoughts?
Yeah. Rajinder, thank you so much for that commentary. I appreciate that. And you know, you're really speaking to, especially with specifically to additionality, and understand of, you know, we've been involved, our company's been involved with the Cap and Trade program since its origin, and understand some of the painstaking processes you guys went through. And but with respect to some of the comments you made around additionality, you know, you know, whether or not one of the challenges and limitations in California, as I'm sure you know, is that that greenhouse gases are highly regulated compared to other states. And so when you're looking at local offsets, you're trying to find opportunities that are of voluntary action that aren't required by federal, state, or local requirements. And so fundamentally, even across the board, creating an offset that's a voluntary action that goes above and beyond what's business as usual as defined as additionality, you know, defining that as Scott Anders went through is an important process to make sure, one, that you're in fact doing a voluntary action and it's not already required or wouldn't otherwise happen. And two, that you're not already double counting, meaning that if there's other programs with the state of California that, as I'm sure you're well aware of, is low carbon fuel standard and some others are renewable portfolio standard, that those programs aren't already taking claim to reductions. And so navigating that and trying to find some opportunities that aren't already claimed or aren't already being you know, meant or labeled in certain programs is an important process of all offsets, of all market-based systems, to make sure that, you know, you maintain that integrity. You mentioned also some land-based projects. Absolutely. I mean, I think some of, you know, what Jay Wintergreen mentioned in some of the things that we're screening forward is looking at land-based options, forestry, agricultural-based reductions, because that is something that is, in many cases, is not currently regulated, and you can potentially find some significant reductions there. And the question still remains, then again, what's the yield for those offsets? Is it meaningful? Does it pencil out economically? You know, can we move forward with those and provide a sufficient volume to meet the incoming demand or potential demand for CEQA mitigation? And I do want to highlight too that you mentioned some of the resources that you had to allocate toward your program, using some of the CARB-approved registries as well as resources. That there's a lot of work that goes into that, a lot of resources and expense, and it's done so to make sure that we're maintaining the integrity of offsets or mitigation to ensure that it meets those fundamental principles. But to your point, you know, there may be some opportunities to define additionality in different ways. It doesn't have to be financial additionality necessarily. There's different ways to look at additionality. There's institutional, there's technological barriers overcome. There's other ways to look at it to provide that definition of additionality. And that's something that's, you know, practitioners and local governments really need to think about. And that's why we dedicated a whole section to this presentation to additionality, is because that's a very important criteria for all offsets, or really any kind of voluntary mitigation that can be claimed by a developer or someone who's in need of offsets for CEQA.
Very good. Thanks, John. So again, I brought back our discussion questions here. Would love to hear from folks with our remaining time. We will be wrapping up by 4:30 at the absolute latest, so as advertised. So thanks again for everybody's close involvement here and your commentary and questions. And again, Rajinder, thank you so much for jumping in, perhaps unexpectedly, to talk a little bit more. We really appreciate your willingness to do that. I know everybody here appreciates that. So further comments or responses from our project team on some of the comments, some of the questions. I think we've spoken to many questions. I know there was a kind of a late question related to, Russ asked a question about how maritime emissions are measured and regulated. And I appreciate Rachel Stern, you jumped in the chat and noted that these are included in the ports inventory. The cruise and cargo ship emissions are regulated by the state. So thank you, Rachel, for that response. So, but again, I want to offer up to everybody. We'd love to hear your thoughts more about these as well. And I know Scott Anders had some thoughts as well. So Scott, please go ahead. I think you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Andy. I wanted to follow on John McDougall's comments, and Rajinder, I really appreciate your being on the webinar and providing the insights. I guess one of the points I was trying to make in my presentation was the fact that our region in particular, and I'm not sure if this is true of all other regions in California, but we have 18 jurisdictions in the unincorporated county, and all but one either has a climate action plan or is working on a climate action plan. And so that creates a slightly, I would say, a slightly different context. And so along the lines of what John was talking about, looking at emissions opportunities that go beyond a local requirement, I think you would bump up into the state requirements. And I think John articulated that well, but I agree with him that there could be opportunities, and I went over it quite quickly in my presentation, but the kind of the areas that we're looking at are there new areas entirely that we just haven't figured out in terms of either offsets or other direct projects? I think the other question that is worth exploring, and I alluded to this briefly, is are there existing efforts or programs or policies or even climate action plan measures that could be expanded or accelerated? I think acceleration gets a little tricky, but you know, if a jurisdiction says that their climate action plan says they're going to plant 100 trees, and then a group of people want to come in and plant 500 trees, is there a way to do that and call it additional? I think to your point though, the same questions arise around administration, tracking, and additionality, or whatever criteria you want to have, but there's an administrative burden, there's a tracking burden. Somebody's got to approve this, as I mentioned. So, you know, a local mitigation bank starts to look an awful lot like a registry in a way. And so I think that's one of the things that we're trying to think through. But in any case, just a follow on to your comments, and really appreciate your perspectives.
Thank you. Thanks for the follow up on there. So, okay. Well, this has been really productive, by the way. And as I'm looking to bring us to a close here in a few minutes, I wanted to again acknowledge that we've still got our questions available here if anybody wants to offer any further thoughts. And I'm going to bring it back to our mural view here in a moment, just to kind of recap some of the key points that we discussed here during our webinar. And but again, any last commentary that anyone wants to offer through the chat function, we welcome that. So let me come back to the mural, and I want to again thank everybody for your comments and input. Those are being fed into the mural here as it is, and hopefully you should see everything we've saw through the chat captured here. So again, from an opportunities perspective for the regional mitigation banks, a lot of some of those different points that came up in the presentation, I think some of the points also brought up separately by some of you, and as you can see, there's more of those points coming in right now. So the team is still populating that a little bit, but of course we've also talked about those constraints as well overall, and then again, the limitations with SAP and some of the newer points that we brought up related to the level of standards for offsets, for example, the technological barriers that come into play, administrative barriers, the time constraints overall. So those are significant considerations and constraints as they are. So we thank you for sharing those ideas. And again, just to reflect back some of our, probably more of our earlier, some of our earlier comments that you all brought forward were captured up here, if you were on the kind of the yellow and orange. And so I want to thank you for that, for a lot of commentary on our presenters' points earlier, and of course for participating in our little polls just to kind of find out where the group stands on some of these key questions that we brought forward about use of offsets and the potential for regional mitigation banks. So, and then finally, I also want to acknowledge a few of you representing jurisdictions. Brendan, for example, City of San Diego, others represented some notes about what you've been doing with your projects overall. So we'll be saving this this digital whiteboard, as we call it, this tool. We'll include it as part of our record of the discussion here today. And in a moment, we're going to talk more about next steps, about how we're going to bring this forward and share with a wider audience. So, but before doing that, I want to go ahead and thank you for your participation and involvement here, and I'll move us into talking a little bit more about next steps. And to do that, I'm going to ask Domingo Vigil with the County of San Diego to come back forward and talk to us a little bit more about next steps and some of the insight. And he may have some additional points that he wants to share. So, so with that, I want to give you my thanks, or thank you for your participation, involvement, your patience with the technology and things like that as things have gone. And with that, Domingo, let me bring you forward, and I'm going to go ahead and unmute yourself and tell us about next steps, please.
Thank you, Andy. And again, thank you so much to all of our speakers today, and also to everybody that was able to join us on this webinar today. The discussion has been very informative, very enlightening, and I certainly hope that everybody else also found it beneficial. As part of our next steps, I think a lot of the information was highlighted in the presentations, as far as the need to develop specific methodologies to screen projects, identifying local project opportunities, talking about determining cost, etc. So there's certainly the need for additional dialogue, a continued dialogue at the regional level, to continue to explore all these areas of opportunity. And as part of that, we are not the only ones. The County of San Diego is certainly not the only entity looking at this topic. There are other organizations who are also very engaged in this conversation. In particular, the San Diego Foundation recently formed the Regional Carbon Offset and Sequestration Collaborative, and we have been having conversations with the foundation and other organizations as well to just expand our knowledge in this area of local carbon offset projects. There's been mentions even in today's presentation about potential local mitigation banks, etc. So certainly a lot of information to continue to discuss. And for that reason, we will also be posting this webinar online to continue to reach out to other organizations who were not with us today, but we certainly want to engage them in the conversation and continue to collect comments and consider all the different perspectives. As far as the San Diego Foundation, I know that we have Lydia with us today. I'm not sure if she's still on or not, but again, it's just another effort that we're working closely with as part of the regional conversation. What we will do next is, aside from posting our webinar today, we will be following up with a survey to everyone who attended, as well as sharing with others. And when we post this out, we certainly would be happy to share with anybody within your network. So if anyone attending today would like to share this webinar with someone else, please feel free to share the link once it's posted and we share it with you. I think that would be very helpful to enrich this conversation today. And again, we'll continue to engage all of the folks present today, as well as additional organizations. So if anybody has any questions about this,
Domingo,
please feel free to reach out to me. Yes?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Lydia is here, and
good.
I was checking with your Lydia. I've unmuted you, so if you wanted to chime in and say hello and chat a little bit more about your effort.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to thank the county and everyone that was involved in these presentations. This has been very, very informative, and it's a lot of work. I can attest to that for sure. So for holding the conversation, I just wanted to really quickly announce or share with the group that the role of the community, of the San Diego Foundation, we see our role as overall conversation. And so there's kind of 4 major roles that we hope to play. The first is continuing to convene the collaborative So folks that are on this Zoom call, if you are interested in joining the collaborative, we're mostly once a month. COVID has thrown us off a little bit, but kind of a check-in. It's a large group of folks that are just trying to figure this out locally. And so then the second role that we see ourselves playing is supporting proposals for policy work and to help dive into this issue a little bit more. We're coordinating obviously with the county and some of the other cities and then some advocates as well to make sure that we're supporting the overall conversation that's happening in the community. And then third role we see is we have some funds that are specifically designated to scientific research. So we'll be rolling out some funds that will help develop local protocols, basically. We believe blue carbon is absolutely an opportunity here locally to develop. So we'll be helping to support organizations that are developing those protocols, and hopefully we'll be able to get them adopted by some of the registry. And then last but not least, we do have an eye on playing the role of a fiscal agent. Currently, we are the fiscal agent for many of the habitat mitigation funds that are operated locally. So we believe that we can hold a similar fund that would be specific to greenhouse gas mitigation. So I'm happy to share my email in the chat if there's any of you that want to follow up and join in the collaborative in the community, or if you have any other questions or suggestions or ideas, I would love to hear about them.
Let me offer thank you, Lydia, and I'll offer, we'll be sending out a follow-up, the project team, this core team will be sending out a follow-up email to all these participants, anyone who can join us today. And if you, it sounds like since you put the offer out there, we can include your email, which you just shared with everybody here in the chat. Thank you. We can include a reference to your email again if anybody who'd like to be part of this, so that there's another place people can find you. So if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you. So good. Bingo. Let's come back to you. I think you're going to finish up closing remarks, and you can say goodbye to everyone, and we'll let everybody go.
Sure. I think that was really it from my end. Again, thanks everyone for being here with us today, joining us on this space, and we will definitely be following up with you within the next few days with the link for the online webinar, also with the survey, and with potential opportunities to continue engaging everyone in the conversation around local greenhouse gas offsets in the San Diego region. So again, thank you for your time today, and I hope you have a great weekend.